All right, thank you for being here. As Jeffrey said, we're going to talk a bit about the new general market. And this panel specifically is going to talk about the change that's happening right now based on the patterns of change that Jeffrey was just speaking about. I'm Tim Malini. I'm head of planning here at Ogilvy. And I am joined by Peter Francis, who is going to join us by Skype. And there he is. My God, a miracle of technology. It's fantastic. Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Fantastic.
Greetings from New Hampshire.
Greetings.
So Peter is in New Hampshire, the heart of diversity. He is, that was a joke, Peter. Founder of American Demographics Magazine, worldwide demographer and trends analyst for Ogilvy Mather, director of demographic forecast for New England Economic Partnership. And to my right is Tanya Odom, a director of innovation and social media executive coach with the Future Work Institute. And Ed Dandridge from Nielsen was going to be here, but he unfortunately could not make it. So the three of us will muscle through the topic. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter and Tanya, you're going to start by briefly talking a bit about what you do and what brought you here. And then after that, we're going to get into some Q&A.
Okay.
Peter, you want to start with that?
Sure. I've been studying demography for quite a few decades, and I've been working with Ogilvy as their demographic trends analyst now for almost 10 years, and it's been quite a ride. But what I have noticed is that the pace of change in terms of diversity is accelerating. And so I have just 5 quick slides that I can show you to give you some concept of just how much diversity is increasing in the U.S. Tim, do you want me to show those now or wait?
Yeah, why don't you dive in, and then I think from that, I think
bet.
Tanya's going to talk a little bit about her perspective, what brought her here, and then we're going to get into a discussion about what it all means and most importantly, how to put it into practice.
Terrific. First of all, let me say to you that we don't know much about diversity here in New Hampshire. Our concept of diversity is when a French Canadian moves into the neighborhood. But nationwide, diversity is really accelerating at an enormous pace, much faster than even I predicted. If we look at the first slide that shows the total number of people in the United States counted by the census at 308.8 million, only 300 million of those actually live in households, about almost 117 million households. When I was doing a forecast a few years ago, I predicted we might close in on 120 million households, but the growth in households has slowed dramatically in this recession, so we only reached not even 117. But that's still the third largest consumer market in the world after India and China. And in terms of consumer spending, far and away the largest consumer market in the world. People in the United States, these 300 million consumers, spend more in a week than quite a few European countries spend all year. We look at the second slide, we can see the compound annual growth rate of these various parts of our population. All consumer growth in the U.S. is at 0.95%, less than 1% a year is the rate of consumer growth. Households are growing at about 1% a year, slightly over 1%. By the way, that is the slowest rate of overall consumer growth in over 50 years. So consumers as a whole are slowing the pace of increase. Hispanic consumers, however, are accelerating their growth, growing at 4 times the average at 3.64% per year. And Asian consumers are pacing them at roughly the same high growth rate of close to 4% per year. The African American population appears to be growing slower at a little over 1% a year, but that growth rate is bifurcated. It's closer to 3 to 4% a year in the suburbs. African Americans are moving from the cities where they have predominantly lived for the past 30 or 40 years to suburban America, and their growth in the suburbs is matching that of the Hispanic and Asian populations. However, the white non-Hispanic majority population, still the majority until about 2050, is barely growing at all, 0.12% per year, a tenth of 1% a year. I doubt there are very many corporate CEOs would be pleased if you came to them and said that our sales growth is going to be limited to a tenth of 1% a year. So the vast majority of growth is clearly in the Hispanic, Asian, and African American populations and other multicultural, racial segments, as we will see in just a minute. I can do pie charts of different parts of the population, and the next slide shows the pie chart of the adult population over age 18. And it shows that nationwide, the white non-Hispanic population is about 2/3 of that pie. However, that's the national average. Here in New Hampshire, that white non-Hispanic is 95%. In Texas and California, as Jeffrey pointed out, it's less than half. And that's certainly true as well in New Mexico and Hawaii. And within this decade, you will see 2 other states join the rank of states where there is no majority population. And those 2 states, of course, are New York and Florida. The Hispanic population nationwide is 14%. African Americans are around 1 in 8, or close to 12%. The Asian, other races, and multiracial make up the rest of the adult population. It's really difficult for me to convey without showing a blizzard of pie charts how different this pie is depending on whether you're looking at suburbs or whether you're looking at people over the age of 65. You're looking at the elderly population, which is about 80% white non-Hispanic. If you're looking at millennials, it's more like 60% white non-Hispanic, 57, 58%, depending on your location. So this pie of adults by race and ethnicity varies tremendously from suburbs to cities, from state to state, and from by age as well. Speaking of age, the next slide shows the population of children under the age of 18, and you can see immediately how much more diverse they are. White non-Hispanic children are a bare majority, and if we go down to children under 5, they are really just 50%, because a majority of all births today are either Hispanic, African American, Asian, or multiracial. As we will see in a minute, the fast growth is in the left-hand side of that pie chart, not in the right-hand side of this pie chart, which in some states is actually declining. White non-Hispanic children will be a minority of children for the foreseeable future in America. Among millennials, the next generation of consumers that is coming of age at the moment, we're looking at about 60% white non-Hispanic and 40% the other part of the pie. The final slide I want to show you is growth. Now, if we looked at this, what's called chart 3, or the last slide I'm going to show, we see dramatic differences in growth rates depending between adults and children. And by the way, this chart used to be way flatter than it is now. If I looked at this chart 20 years ago, I likened it to a race among turtles. There was hardly any movement. But now you can see that white non-Hispanic children are actually declining. They're declining in 46 out of 50 states. Only 4 states, North and South Carolina, Idaho, and Utah, are the only states where white non-Hispanic children are not declining. Just here in New England, there are 200,000 fewer fewer children, period, than there was 10 years ago because of this decline. Even among African American children, they are declining nationwide, although there is a great deal of growth in the suburbs and in certain states where African Americans are migrating to. But among Hispanics, Asians, and multiracial, there is very, very high growth in children. And again, if we look at the pie chart of families with kids, we see that they are more and more becoming Hispanic, Asian, or multiracial. Multiracial children are growing the fastest, but they're pretty close to the Asian and Hispanic growth rates in terms of numbers of increase. Among adults, you can see only 4% increase in the past 10 years among white non-Hispanics, and about 10 times that growth rate among Hispanic and Asian adults. African Americans are growing about half that rate, but again, in the suburbs, much faster. Other races and multiracial adults are growing, but not as rapidly as the Hispanic and Asian population. Only about a quarter of all U.S. growth of adults in the past decade were white non-Hispanics, and virtually all growth among children in this decade will be either Hispanic, Asian, or multiracial. So if you want growth in sales, growth in volume, whatever you're looking for, we're looking for a diverse population in the South and in the West. 3/4 of all Hispanics in America live in just 7 states. Asian population is about equally concentrated in a number of large metropolitan areas. And even the African American population, as Jeffrey pointed out, is fairly highly concentrated in large cities and in larger states. Growth, however, is where it's at, and growth is clearly a picture of diversity. Now, Tim, I'm going to turn this back to you. But before I do, let me say that I will be coming out with a new white paper in about a month or two when the full census comes out, called American Diversity, and shows many more pie charts than this. If you would like a copy, just tell Tim, and I'll get your email addresses and make sure that you get it. Also, Tim, if you'd repeat any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, Tanya, I'm getting a little feedback here. Anybody notice that? Everybody notices that. Fantastic. All right. Now, thank you, Peter. I'm now going to ask Tanya to talk about why she's here, and then we're going to ask some questions and invite you to ask some questions about what it all means and how to put it into practice as marketers. So could you talk a little bit about what brought you here and your background specifically?
First of all, thank you. It's going to be very hard for me to sit on this chair because I'm used to standing. So if I hop off, everything's all right? I'll be okay. So I'm here because Jeff and Donna invited me here. That's the truth. And I just want to thank them, and the work that went into this is unbelievable. And I was at the ANA conference in November when this was launched, and I'm just so proud to be partnering with Ogilvy on this. So I think the perspective that the Future Work Institute brings, if you want to just load the first slide, is that we look at the future in a lot of different ways. So one is that we talk about diversity and inclusion overall. So our work is cross-industry, global. I spent the last 6 months back and forth to South America. So a lot of what I'll say also I can't deny has been obviously affected by my work in Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Peru, and Argentina, just in listening to the voices there. But we look at the diversity and the work that needs to be done in a real 360 approach. So we are non-moving, non-budging about the fact that race and gender is still important. I can show you tons of slides, that's great, but I can also say as an executive coach that coaches mostly women of color, I know that race and gender is important. And so with all of this new data, our belief is that we still can't move away from doing the deeper dive into race and gender. And then we look at this sort of cross-lateral approach, looking at multi-generational differences, which we've heard talked about, but you'll see a photo in a second. We can't deny that the younger millennial generation and below, by the way, the newer generation is called everything in Europe from Gen Z to a whole bunch of different things. But we have to also see that this affects the concept of culture, multiracial, multicultural groups. But also, we look into the future, new ways of working and learning. I think even at the ANA conference in November, we heard a lot about smartphones and the use of Latinos with the use of smartphones and the increase in that number. So I think we look at this from a holistic approach. And then there's the people approach. If we can load the second slide. When I asked Donna which slides out of all the ones she's seen should I show, and then I talked to Jeff, this was the one, right? So it's a little self-serving, and those of you who know me as very private, now you've seen my family, right? So I am biracial. I'm one of those multiracial people that before 2000 checked the other box on the census, right? I look white in corporate America. In New York, I'm Boricua just because, right? You know, I speak Spanish. And when we don't know how to categorize someone, and in Peru, I was actually the object of a waiter's conversation. He came over to me in Lima and said to me, Miss, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure. I was by myself at dinner. And he said, all the waiters want to know where you're from. I was thinking, if you all have nothing better to do. But the question was, you look different, and listen to this, you speak Spanish so well. And I said, I'm American. He said, how do you speak Spanish well? Interesting stereotype, right, about us. So all the way, you'll see on the right, my dad's African American, my mom is white Irish American. So when you think about me as a consumer, as a marketer, as an employee, who are you marketing to? Right? The biracial person who's a Gen X woman. How many of you saw the Generation X article that appeared in the New York Times recently? Right? There was one, I can send it to you if you come up to me, there's one that was in the UK Mail that was even worse, calling us the burnt out generation last week, right? So when we think about, so is that who you're marketing to? Or how about this one? I have a sister with cerebral palsy and very family-oriented background, some of you know this. The person sitting on the floor putting the flowers on Mia's crutches is my other sister whose wedding day it was. And she is there putting the crutches on Mia's crutches because she couldn't hold the bouquet like the rest of us. So are you marketing to me as someone with a person with a disability in my family? Or the middle slide. So this, my niece Olivia, who's the one in the devil costume, who's 11, loves this. Because ANA had over 600 people, so she went to school telling people that 600 people saw her photo. But the important piece about this photo, their mothers are both my sisters, but Olivia, who's in the red costume, her father's Nigerian, educated in Britain. Her mother is my sister, who's biracial. Gabriela, who's the younger baby there, who's now 1, her mother's my sister, her father's half Puerto Rican and black. That is the new generation, right? So our approach is to say, one, I always say we have to be careful about this multiracial number, by the way. And I know later you're gonna hear from Mr. Burnett talking about black is the new green, which really cautions us to segment any one group, right? Multiracial who? There have been multiracial people for years, right? We're not new. So some of you know this story, but I went to a neurologist recently on the Upper East Side, and he looked at me, and I knew what was coming, and he said to me, can I ask you a question? And those of you who look a little melange like me, you know this, right? So I knew what was coming, and he looked at me, he said, what are you? And I was like, here we go. So I said it really quickly, and I said, let's go, right? And he looked at me, and he said, there must have been a lot going on in the plantation, right, is what he said to me. Which, yeah, those of you who live in New York, you know, come on now, this is not new. But I looked at him, he was right. Multiracial people are not new. This is not a new phenomenon. Barack Obama is not the only multiracial person. And if we're really smart about this discussion, we'll really look at what's not in the data, which is what I've been asked to be here for. So this is the long answer to your question.
Perfect.
That is that we have to then segment it into education, income level, generational differences, geographic location, nation of origin, all of these things I think that are present in this slide. So what the Future Work Institute does is we go into organizations like Ogilvy. We've been working with Ogilvy for quite some time doing education, but we also do organizational assessments. And so whenever I see this data, I always think about how cautious we have to be about looking at a rise in a number of people and thinking that that means that more people will have access. And so our approach to how to define our sort of connection to these groups of people, to me, has to be very different. What I've learned in doing this work for over 17 years, people of color will not automatically trust an organization or a brand strategy or a marketing campaign if they don't believe the organization is truthful or committed to their community. So all of this is wonderful, but then there's a backstory that I think we also need to look at. So I'll just stop there, but I think that's helpful.
That's extremely
and I have to tell Olivia, who, by the way, is now studying French in France with her other sort of aunt, that now her picture was seen by more people. She'll be very happy about that.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And who, the cute little girl there?
Gabriela, my niece.
No, that's you, isn't it?
Oh, with the red hair, yes, that's me, yeah.
Okay, so let me ask a question based on what you just said, and
Yeah.
this is to Peter as well. So one of the things that's great about the data that Peter showed us and demographics in general is it shows us where things are headed, where we've been, where they're headed. So you can predict with a fair degree of certainty 5 years from now, 10 years from now, broadly speaking, what the U.S. population is gonna look like, right? And yet it seems like, so I guess the question is why now all the buzz about this? Because 10 years ago, we knew it was headed this way. 5 years, we knew it was headed this way. And it seems like right now, there's a lot of energy around this. And is that because there's a critical mass that's been reached in terms of buying power and the consumer market driving these conversations? Is it because we have an environment in which people are able to talk about it, forums like this one? Is it because we now have media from a marketing standpoint that can get really targeted? Why do you think this is as hot a topic as it is now relative to a few years ago?
And I mean, Peter, you might have a different response. I mean, I just think from reading this report and thinking about Jeff's comments, you know, there's a line in here which says that the term cross-cultural marketing originated in the 1930s. Right, so it's not new in that way. For me at least, we talk about things a little bit differently in our language. We've been talking about the emerging majority for quite some time. And so people have asked us, is that political correctness? And we've said, no, it's actually demographics, which so the pie charts you saw. I don't think we have a choice anymore. I don't think organizations have a choice. Donna began by talking about talent. That's my sort of take on this. So I don't do the work that many of you do in the advertising or marketing end, but I do the work in terms of talent, hiring, development, and coaching. And so for me, you cannot not do this, I think, is part of it. The other thing I think it is that you saw Peter's slides and also just what we know. I think the census and our undercounting of people, in particular the Latino population, has really shown us what we don't know. You know, the fact that we, in the first time we did the 2000 census and allowed multiracial people to classify ourselves as something other than other, the United States and sort of the government was amazed at the number of people in the country that were able to check that box. And so now we're still trying to pull apart what the multiracial people category looks like. So 32 million, they're saying, one of the fastest growing. I think we're now seeing that maybe we didn't do it so well in the past, and we need to look at this. But I think for some of us who've been working in this field a long time, it's not now. It's just everybody just has now gotten it.
Right.
That wasn't very nice, but I think that's sort of.
No, that's really, I mean, because you didn't see forums like this, you know, a couple years ago, let alone 5 years ago. Peter, what's your take on that?
Well, Tim, I think that the general marketing folks could ignore the rising diversity in the United States until one day one of them woke up and realized and slapped their forehead and said, OMG, the babies are going to start to retire. I am toast when my target market that I've been selling to for the last 30 years or so is suddenly going to get one of those license plates that says retired, no money, no phone, etc., and stop spending. And they were convinced. In fact, I've had people come up to me and grab me by the lapels and say, what am I going to do when the baby boomers retire? My gravy train is leaving the station. And I said, well, wake up, pal. Millennials are coming along, but they are very, very different from baby boomers, not just psychologically, but by race and ethnicity. And you have to pay attention to cross-cultural marketing. And they said, oh, really? Do I? How come? Can't I just convince baby boomers not to retire? And I said, no, I don't think so. And I said, but relax, they won't be retiring all at once. A lot of them haven't saved any money, and so they're going to be working for quite some time. But also, don't forget, baby boomers, many of them are now grandparents. I just finished a big piece on grandparenting for MetLife, and grandparents are, half of all grandparents are baby boomers. And so they're spending lots of money on their grandchildren. But so we don't want to give up on them yet, but the people who are buying homes, the starter homes, the growth in dwellings, in households that are going to start happening, it's millennials, pal. That's where the action is. And they are way, way, way more diverse than baby boomers ever thought of being. So you have to shift your focus away from those boomers who are eventually going to leave, going to be less valuable to you as consumers, and the millennials will be more valuable. And of course, sandwiched in between them are the hapless Gen Xers really shouldn't be so looked down upon. They're sort of middle diverse, and they are important as well, but they suffer from being between two giants of millennials with 85 million and baby boomers 79, 80 million and fading. But the millennials are growing, and so that's really, I think it's people are looking for an alternative to baby boomers. That's all.
I also think some of the language that we use in our work is, it used to be seen as a nice thing to do. So you look at a lot of the diversity and inclusion programs in the past, and they were community connections or community-based programs. This was not just here, this was in Europe as well. So they may be connected to a small not-for-profit, they may have been a community forum or event. Now, our language has been it's a competitive advantage, and I think that's exactly what's been said. But we've also seen, and Jeff talks about this a lot, other organizations coming out doing this work. And so it's really looking at the dollars and saying, what are we losing out on? Similarly to Donna's point about talent, what talent are we losing if we don't get it? Or to John's point this morning, this makes us a better company. So I think there's that competitive advantage that we're also seeing more easily understood than it has in the past.
Could you go ahead, Peter.
Tim, can I just add one point to that?
Absolutely.
Married couples with children are a very, very important target market for most people. And married couples with children did not grow over the past decade at all of them in total. But Hispanic, African American, married couples with kids, in fact, did grow a lot. And what's happening is that married couples with children, which have the highest spending of any household typology, all the growth is among Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, and so forth. And so if you're targeting that important market segment, white non-Hispanics are shrinking in that marketplace fairly quickly. And if that is your target market, you have no choice, pal.
OMG. So I'm gonna ask you before the next question, everybody to, as questions occur to you, please raise your hand. We're gonna try to make the rest of the session as interactive as possible. So feel free to interrupt. Not yet, that was too damn fast, but you're next. And we'll just jump in and out. I have a bunch of other questions based on what we talked about earlier, but if we don't go up that way, that would be fantastic. Yes, please go ahead.
Actually, I have two questions, and they're both for Peter. The first is, given the prognostication that you're, thank you. Given the prognostication that you're able to see based on the statistics, do you foresee a time in the relatively near future, 20, 50 years out, where we'll have zero population growth as a country, and what are the implications for that, notwithstanding the demographic segments of growth that you've outlined? And then the second question is, you talked about household formation and how that was stagnant. What are the factors that are contributing to that? Are people just not getting married? Are they waiting later, et cetera?
Peter, did you hear those?
I did.
Okay.
Thank you very much. To answer your first question is, it will be a very, very long time before we reach zero population growth for a couple of reasons. One is that we are already there in terms of New England. There are large parts of New England that have essentially no population growth at all, and parts of the Midwest as well. And the consequences of that very low or zero growth, the economic consequences are becoming evident, and they're not fun. They're not positive at all. Labor force starts to decline, and essentially large swaths of the Northeast and Midwest go into a form of permanent recession. And so what happens when that occurs is that people collar their politicians and say, you got to do something for us. And of course, the number one thing you can do is to allow more immigration. And so there's a fair bit of anti-immigration sentiment right now. Trust me, that will disappear as the economy starts perking up in the rest of the country. And the Northeast and the Midwestern states that need them will push for allowing more immigrants. We allow a tiny fraction, 1/3 of the number of immigrants that Canada does in proportion to their population. And when we get closer to the Canadian model of allowing roughly 1% of our population to come from abroad each year, we will begin growing again. But what kind of population will that be? Guess what? It will be Hispanic, it'll be Asian, it will unlikely to come from Europe, which is of course where our immigration came from in the past. Now, in terms of household formation and families, I think that you're going to see birth rates, which are now, there's over 4 million births a year, start picking up as more millennials get jobs. The recession really put a hammerlock on household formation. There are millions and millions of millennials, unfortunately, still living with their parents. And at some point, when you're living with your parents, a little L starts coming up on your forehead. That's not good, not good for one's psyche or anything else for that matter. And so the parents, being baby boomers, are reluctant to kick them out of the nest, but at some point they will leave and form households and get married. But right now, it's not economically feasible for many millennials to even think about getting married or moving out of their parents' home. And when they start thinking about it, they're going to move in large numbers. And I think you're going to see household formation spike within the next 24 months to well over 1 million a year. And there's a lot of economic opportunity there. Remember, almost half of those new households will be either Hispanic, African American, or Asian. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir, you had a question?
Yeah, my question is for Tanya. You raised, I think, an important question about what the data does not show. And I think you mentioned two things. You talked about access, and you also talked about an authentic sort of commitment to certain communities in order to have that kind of access. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by access, but also could you give us a couple more things that maybe you think the data does not show?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the question basically said that I talked about the fact that access was one of the things that we need to look at beyond the data, and also the topic of authenticity, sort of how do you connect to a community, and if I could expand on that. So I think access, half of my world is in the education arena. My master's is in education, working in predominantly communities of color, urban communities of color with young kids. So I can't have these conversations, particularly with all due respect to all of the data on the millennial generation, knowing that many of the young kids I work with in the communities I work with, East New York being one of them, does not include the kids in my world. So that is just something I have to say, that when I look at data, I always have that slice of reality, that my students don't often have the access to some of these sort of two ways and all these things. It's funny though, I have one kid who's being recruited by the Bloods and the Crips, and I tell the story because talk about why technology is important. And we email back and forth, so I make sure he's okay because he was suspended. And I live between New York and DC, and I was on the Acela, and he emailed me for 3 hours back and forth until I got to the DC train station to make sure I was okay. Right, so that is his communication, and that was his way of looking out for me. Thank goodness I did not need him getting on my train thinking he needed to protect me the whole way, right? But so in that way, I think the technology piece of the research is right. The issue about being the most educated generation in history, sure, if they get access beyond what we're seeing in terms of middle and high school. The authenticity piece I think I've seen over the course of my career. I won't use company examples, but I think the Latino population is a very good population to look at. We look at these campaigns that have been done, and I hope none of these have been done by Ogilvy, so I have to be careful. But in terms of looking to advertise, to connect to the Latino market, and really segmenting it, because we only know one group of people. So if we're in Miami, we may know Cuban. If we're in New York, we may know Puerto Rican, maybe Dominican if we're savvy. But we're not really looking at what that means across the board. So I've seen companies create platforms and create campaigns that actually really denigrate a group of people, to the extent that one Latino group said to their company, we do not all eat burritos, right? I did a focus group of Latino people, and they said, if I see one more commercial, this is a consumer products company, if I see one more commercial with salsa music in the background, and they said, and old salsa music, which is so having lived in the Dominican Republic and you hear merengue 24/7, I don't know, I like salsa, but if you live in DR, you have a different appreciation. I've also seen some really close calls with the African American community and not understanding some of the cultural nuances, right? So I'm sorry, people in my life, my father, my brother-in-law, do not all speak in Ebonics, do not all live in one community, do not all play basketball or listen to hip hop. And if you segment what we see about African Americans or Black Americans in this country, that is oftentimes what campaigns are targeting. I went to Harvard and Vassar, okay? That's where I went to school. I'm not putting it out there because I still owe them both a lot of money. But the point is, why don't we see any Black people that went to Harvard or Vassar being targeted for some of these campaigns, right? The bougie Black community in New York City alone is a target. Go to Fort Greene. If you don't know this, just get off the train, walk around a little bit, right? Just see, and you'll see a piece that, where is that market being targeted? It's not. It's not. So to me, there's a loss in that way. And by the way, some people have gotten it, and I see this is where we need to look at some of the smaller businesses. Some of the women and, quote, minority-owned businesses have, I think, targeted these groups pretty well. So I think for me, the authenticity piece is also supported by research on what African American, Asian, and Latino consumers look for from products and from organizations, and they all look for different things, right? So African Americans tend to look for respect as one of the first things. Latino people look oftentimes for brand names. I can tell you tons of times where I made a fool of myself when I was learning Spanish, because a lot of the names, how many of you speak Spanish fluently? Grew up in the Caribbean? So things like Colgate is what in Spanish? Colgate, that's just what you say. Or how do you say vapor rub? Vaporub. Vaporub is a cure for everything that ails you. No, in the Caribbean, seriously. So these things that have become part of common conversation, these companies have obviously done well in a different way. But we can also talk offline, but those are just some examples, yeah.
Tanya, thank you very much for that. That was very insightful, and you reminded me that there is no census of psychographics. And even the census, the 2010 census, there's only one short form. There's no education data. There's no income data. So when you say, what is the census not showing? It's not telling us a lot of things. And one of the most important things it's not telling us is that among millennials, among 25 to 34-year-old millennials, there are 2 million more women college graduates like you, Tanya, than there are men. And so when you're targeting millennials, the best educated people are women. The best educated woman in America is 30 years old. The best educated man in America is 60. Hello?
Yes.
That was another wow.
Yeah, that was another OMG moment, Peter. We had to take a breath after that one.
Baby boomers baby boomer men
NFW.
went to college
Right.
to avoid Vietnam in huge numbers. But once the Vietnam War was over and the draft was over, guys decided college, not so much, thank you very much. I'd rather go to work. And they made a big mistake. But women college graduates outnumbered men college graduates throughout the United States. And they really outnumber them among millennials. So when you're targeting folks like Tanya, she's right. You better realize that your target market is probably a college graduate woman. Her husband, not so much. Sorry, Tanya.
Yeah, no, that's okay. But I have to say something.
Dive in.
So this is, again, just because my researches are on race and gender. And if you look at some of the research around the sort of college graduates, the challenge, though, is this is about access and opportunity again. And again, you don't bring a diversity person onto the stage and not let them do this. But we still make less as women. So all of the research came out about all these numbers of women graduates. By the way, then when we segment Black women and Latina and Asian women, the data totally falls apart a little bit, right? We know that Black women have been in college. We have more than Black men. But we also look at the pay gap that these articles then had to do almost a sub-response by saying, in fact, women are still making less. So again, this is what I guess I'm here to do, is to say we have to dig deeper on all of these things, just to look at a holistic picture.
All right, thank you. Yes, you had a question.
Yeah, the question is more. My question is for Tanya, but more for the entire panel. Tanya, you touched on it briefly about how, for example, in the Hispanic market, not everyone listens to salsa music, and in the African American market, not everyone listens to hip hop. But you also touched on authenticity. I'm curious how you as advertisers bridge that gap between keeping an authentic experience versus falling into stereotypes.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm not in the community. What I can say is I would just point to the New York Times article about this conference, which I hope you all saw yesterday, where you hear the organization saying that they're going to look to the 9 professional networks internally to give them information and data. Donna talked about Frito-Lay. I can tell you in financial services, it's being done for the baby boomer millennial market all the time. So I think one of the things we've seen as a best practice is turning to people internally. American Express has done it, and they've done pilots with use of their cards. McDonald's has done it, Best Buy has done it. I also think what we've seen people do, and I found out about this at the ANA conference, is giving those groups latitude in their creativity. So the course that I recently taught at Georgetown was Innovation and Creativity. And my research and the work I look at is how do you help people be creative? So you can't just say because we have a group of Latino people, they're going to make sure they bring out the best ideas, or African Americans, but giving them the space and the trust and the respect so that they can bring their ideas to the table. So that's been a little of my experience just around, one, what professional networks can do. The second thing is, I think real connections to community. Communities don't just need a banner on the day of the marathon in New York City, right? They need sort of a consistent connection and relationship that spans more than event. When we talk about diversity in my work, we talk about a change process versus a program. And I'd say it's the same thing with this, program versus process, right?
Peter, I don't know if you heard the question, but I want to spin it a bit for you, which is when you work with clients and look at the data that you have access to, you just touched on something in terms of things that aren't in the census. What do you think is often, what are the most common mistakes or assumptions made, or what's most often overlooked when people look at the data in maybe just a superficial way?
The worst mistake that anyone can make in marketing is to think, even for a second, that your customers are like your friends, your family, your neighbors, or anybody that you know personally. Because I often find people projecting from their own experience and saying, well, my uncle this, or my sister that, or my cousin, etc., likes this or that or the other thing. When you talk about a country with 300 million people in it and market segments of 50.5 million Hispanics, we're not talking about neighbors and friends and family. We're talking about large consumer markets that are complex, and as Tanya has pointed out, has layers of complexity to it. And so I urge everyone, when they're thinking about who their customer base is, to do the kind of research necessary, both survey research as well as qualitative research in terms of focus groups, to find out not only what's on their minds, but how many of them are there. Most of the people I talk to are really surprised, very surprised to find out that married couples with children, which they think is the mass market in America, is 1 out of every 5 households. 1 in 5, 20% of households. Married couples with children in America are a niche market. Maybe that's the only people who live in your neighborhood, but nationally, and even in most suburbs, it's a niche market, and they just do not understand that. And so I think that looking at the data and trying to get a handle on the whole market, not projecting from your personal experience, I think is the thing that I keep talking about when I speak with Ogilvy's clients.
That's great, thank you. Yes, we have another question right there.
Yes, my question is twofold. To Tanya, usually I'm a former executive from the spirit industry, and the bottleneck in regards to accepting information was with middle management. Senior levels get it, are progressive, but middle management becomes uncomfortable and they don't know what to do with the information, and then it comes to trickle-down effect. So I wouldn't mind getting insight in regards to how do you all handle that within your own system? And then my second question is to Peter. We understand psychographic with the millennials. I have a millennial in my house, and she is a global individual. So will we start converging our senses from a psychographic globally versus just domestically?
You want to take the
Tanya? Ooh.
Yeah, I know, Peter, you have the harder question, I think. Unfortunately, I think that We still see sort of the middle manager, oftentimes bottleneck, as you called it, or challenge, we call it sometimes. I will say what's changing that are reports like this, our information, we see that changing. To me, it's about making sure they understand the competitive advantage. I don't know that we've always done such a great job of having them see that it's a numbers game right now. And if you don't do this, other people will. Peter's told us about the Millennial Generation. We're spending a lot of time. There are a couple of wonderful reports on the multicultural Millennial Generation, which I can talk to you about offline, but I think we know that this is a generation that people need to pull in and rope in. And if we don't do it, then what's the case? And I have to say, using generational diversity as an example, that oftentimes our education is focused at the mid-level, and generational diversity is, they get it. Literally, after a 92-minute, 2-hour module, done, boom, okay, I get it. We think differently, we have different values, we work differently, but how can we make this work? The other thing I think we sometimes do is, and one of my colleagues helped me see this, it depends on how we approach this conversation. Do we approach it from a strengths-based approach? Do we say, I always say for the different generations, if not for this generation, we would not have. And I think we can do it for all of the different racial ethnic groups as well, right? It doesn't mean you're any less, but I know that this is what this group brings to my life. This is what this group brings to this community, this organization, this executive team. So I attended an event last week at Citi, and co-sponsored by McKinsey, where they, if you haven't seen this new research on women, it's unbelievable, really. I mean, we know this cognitively, but really to see the data, to Peter's point, supporting it. And we look at some of the things that their research, McKinsey's research says, hold people back, or to women back. Two things they highlight and they give language to. One, they talk about individual mindsets and organizational mindsets. That's not eureka information to any of us, particularly those of us who've dealt with those individuals or organizations. But what a great way to finally start to see the research. So those individual, but the acknowledgement that there are organizational mindsets as well. So I think that's where the culture piece comes in. And I can talk to you more. But I do think it's the education piece we're seeing. Yeah.
And Peter, the question about the emerging psychographics and looking at those as opposed to the demographics to find a common thread.
And the global piece too.
Millennials are the first generation to come of age and to come into the job market, as it were, and become adults who are going to be purchasing homes and cars and what have you, become consumers, essentially. They're the first generation of new consumers to really get the fact that this is a global information-based economy. It is not a domestic manufacturing or a domestic services-based economy. Many, many more millennials, I wish I had the number to show you, but I can get it for anyone who wants it. Many more millennials are bilingual than baby boomers, way more than baby boomers. And they're bilingual because they understand the cultural differences between the United States and the language that the country of the language of which they speak, the other country. And they're much more willing to go on the net and find ideas and to search for things that might be in Europe, might be in Latin America, might be in Asia. They don't care where the ideas come from, where the concepts come from. They go on the web to look for everything, whether it be a recipe or whether it be something to purchase. And so that's a difference, a fundamental difference in attitude. The attitude of Tea Partiers, if I can use a phrase that's in vogue today, is much more internal to the United States. The view of millennials is much more external. And so when you're talking about the creation of commercials, the creation of images, words and images that convey this understanding that this is a global marketplace are very important for young adults. They also understand how competitive it is, and they want a competitive edge. And anything that you can give them in your advertising to make them just a little bit smarter than the next person, and allow them to compete in this global economy will be much appreciated.
Great advice. Yes, sir.
I don't know if I need a mic.
Hello, I appreciate the comment. I just want to go back to Jackie Lee's question because it was maybe a couple of points that she made, and and asked a number of questions, but I think one of the focal points that she asked that didn't get quite addressed really revolves around the question of the middle managers, and I would just say, I would rephrase it and say, the gatekeepers to this whole issue of inclusion and diversity. She started by saying the upper management usually gets it. Okay, but the middle managers, those are the gatekeepers. How can we make sure that they get it?
Tim, you want me to take?
And she added and held somewhat accountable so that we all progress.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I think many organizations have gone accountability routes that haven't worked, right? So I think for me, my experience is it depends on the industry. I don't know that there's one way. I can tell you what some organizations have done in financial services. This tying to compensation, there's some research recently that says that doesn't work, right? Whereas many organizations are still saying, let's push towards tying it to compensation and make that a change. My experience has been, one is that middle manager level is becoming more diverse by the fact of who's coming into the organization. You can look at Ogilvy as a perfect example, right? Donna's work on increasing the number of associates of color, bringing them in, that changes the culture of an organization. But the other thing that we've sort of said is, I think accountability is not just about compensation, it's how people are measured. And I will tell you, just having worked with a company last week, the executive interviews that I did, the CEO even said, we are not valuing people development in this organization as much as we are valuing sort of technical skills, right? Whatever that looks like. So it's going to be a culture shift. Our experience is, and again, I would have to go industry by industry. Some industries, it is a matter of, I'm not so sure the top always gets it. That's a modality we don't go by as much anymore. They may get it in their language and in their speeches, but the reality is if some of the executive teams wanted to make it happen, it would have happened in organizations. Look, this is what I always say, and Donna's going to be like, why did I ask her to come? The reality is, if the United States of America and U.S. corporations wanted to address issues of representation at the senior levels of organizations, it would have been done. So there's a piece about, we always say senior level groups get it. I'm not, in my experience, that's not always the case. So I just want to put that out there. And I can talk to you more offline, but I don't know that there's one answer for each, that would fit all categories.
And we're just about out of time, but Peter, I'm going to ask you to comment on that as well, more about this notion of middle management getting it, and from your experience in terms of the data being at a place where it's almost impossible to ignore.
Middle managers have lagged behind in some respects because they really haven't become convinced as yet, but I think they will become convinced that understanding multicultural marketing and understanding the way in which we have become an enormously successful multicultural nation is the singular competitive advantage that we have. And until we fully integrate this concept of competitive advantage, one of the countries, for example, that we have been competing with for years is Japan. Now, there's nothing multicultural about Japan. Nothing. It is as monocultural as they get. And their economy has gone nowhere for more than a decade. And so if we want our economy to regain its robust growth after this recession, we have to understand the strength of multicultural marketing and understand the strength of believing in multiculturalism and embrace it. And when middle management gets that message or is given that message by senior management, this won't be an issue anymore.
A great topic. I'm sorry we don't have time for more of the questions. Both Peter and Tanya are available offline. I want to thank them, and I want to thank you for making this such a lively discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.